is the last B-24 delivered from Willow Run Airport. Now, does anybody see anything unusual about that airplane? There's no de-icing boots on it. It's not an all-weather B-24. It's the last one built. Ford had to put 2.5 hours on it as part of the contract. Go up, feather both engines, all the engines, start them up again, drop some bombs. And then they delivered it to Romulus Airfield, Romulus Army Airfield, which is now Metro. And there the ferry commander picked the airplane up. So Ford test flew it, gave it to the Army. The Army put 3.7 hours on it, flying it to Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, where it sat for somewhere between 12 and 15 months before it was chopped up and spent. Almost all the airplanes built after about February to March of 1945, with the exception of like C-47, C-54s that had civilian use, were flown to scrapyards and cut up. And why did they do that? Because of what happened in World War I, I'm sure Chris could expand on this, where the government arbitrarily canceled contracts as soon as the war was over. And companies had tremendous money invested in building equipment for the military. Now they're stuck with stuff they can't sell. So in the World War II contracts, you had a contract to build so many airplanes, you were guaranteed you could build those airplanes, but they had no need for them. This is the Ford Willow Run bomber plant in the spring of 1945. It's had the addition of Hangar 2 down here, the Butler Run hangars used to call them. Parking lots are full, the airfield's out there. But this is the Ford Willow Run bomber plant that was built here at Willow Run Airport. It was built for the exclusive production of the B-24 bomber. Fighters defend countries, and the fighters in the Battle of Britain defended England. But fighters don't win wars. And early as September of 1940, the US and the British had identified that the 4-engine bomber would be the primary offensive weapon for the Allies in World War II. And at that time, the B-24 was the finest bomber flying. And we should never forget, we talk about the production miracle, how quick they can build a B-24 bomber, but tens of thousands of these crew members made that collection of expensive nuts and bolts and aluminum into something that could deliver force to the enemy. And these crews probably got as close as you can get in any situation. And it's amazing how many you run across these guys, and they're still in touch with guys that they only worked with for about 6 months. But it was such a shaping part of their life that they don't forget each other. The first chapter of my book is called How Detroit Saved the World. And some people say that's kind of arrogant. It wasn't Detroit that saved the world. It was the Navy, the Air Force, the guys at D-Day. But in Detroit, mass production was perfected, starting with Henry Ford. And there you see him with his runabout that he built, and the Model T. The Model T incorporated standardized parts, moving assembly line, increased production, and reduced cost. This is the Model R, the last one built before the Model T. This is the Detroit factory down in Detroit. Who's been down there in that building? I want to go down there sometime because they tell me the 3rd and 4th floors are almost the way he left it in 1910. Yeah, I'd love to go see that.
You won't leave.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's great.
So they're building like 25 cars a day, and the guy goes and gets the part, carries to the chassis, and he does everything. He puts the springs on, the motors in. One guy built a car. But then he came along with the moving assembly line, the Model T. Here's the Highland Park plant, 1914. They're building 1,000 Model Ts a day. Goes to the $5 a day wage. Makes the workers now owners of cars. But Ford was made obsolete by this man right here. Alfred Sloan. Alfred Sloan of GM brought in marketing to arms. The model changeover each year. The stair step, buy a Chevrolet, get a little victory, buy a Pontiac, move up to the Cadillac. And what this did, it gave the auto industry tremendous flexibility. Like the Model T line was basically unchanged for 17 years. Chevrolet was building a brand new car every year. So tooling, production, the ability to change had to come into the market. And when World War II came, the US was able to convert from civilian to military production far faster than anyone else in the world because of this flexibility. And here's one of the secret weapons of the US in World War II. That's my father. He wasn't the secret weapon, but he was one of those high school hot rodders. And he's got his board and stroke 39 Ford there. He was a graduate of the Ford Trade School. He was a toolmaker at Highland Park, and he went to Willow Run in like February of 1942 and stayed there the entire time the airplanes were being built at Willow Run. But in 1940, 85% of the cars in the world were registered in the US. The high school hot rodders, the guy down on the farm, a monkey wrench and a socket set was not unusual. We had the most mechanically literate population in the world. And we've all read stories of the GIs and the beaches improvising their Jeeps and their tanks to do things. We were unmatched in our ability to fix things and build things. Chris knows a lot more about this than I do, but from my readings, the mobilization when we got involved in World War I was late. And it was run from Washington. And when congressmen look out for their constituents, it may not necessarily be looking out for the country. I read we were building 33 different rifles in the US. Congressmen would say, oh, my district's got a factory that can make a gun. I'm going to make sure they get a contract. Well, do you know what a mess that is to the guys in the front line? Your gun breaks. And you've got 33 different guns that you might have to get parts for. So nothing's going on. So Wilson forms the War Industries Board. And the War Industry Board starts to allocate, but it's still kind of a mess. And they bring on a Wall Street financier. Just think of that. Wilson, the progressive, brought on a Wall Street financier to help him solve problems. Bernard Baruch, right there. Wall Street financier comes in, and he starts to bring order to production, standardizing on a few solid models that will build by the thousands. And by the end of 1918, US production is starting to take off, and our equipment started to flow to Europe, but of course the war is over. Well, as soon as the war is over, there's a guy watching this. His name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he watched how Washington floundered in the mobilization for World War I. He also watched the order that Baruch had brought to the mobilization, and he and Baruch became good friends. He had Baruch working in his administration. Baruch was a great contributor to the Roosevelt campaign, so they became friends. After World War I, the US decides if we don't have any weapons, we can never be involved in a war again. So they cancel contracts on short notice. They stick manufacturers with tremendous bills for equipment that they manufactured that they now cannot sell to the government because they canceled the contracts. To even make it absolutely no weapons being produced, they pass a law that if you own equipment that's used to manufacture weapons, you cannot depreciate it. And it'll be taxed at full value as long as it's in existence. Bethlehem Steel, the largest arms producer in the US, within 90 days had destroyed all capability of producing arms again to avoid the tax consequences. Because we'd never fight a war again. World War I was going to be the last war we fought. We didn't need this military. Well, then this guy comes along. He becomes chancellor in 1932. He scolds his ministers for not spending enough on military preparation. He starts to mobilize the German economy to a full wartime economy. Right next to him here is Hermann Göring. He's going to become head of the Luftwaffe. He's going to build the most powerful air force in the world. By 1938, The Germans have the most modern and largest fleet in the world. All of Europe is being blackmailed by the German Air Force. Their bombers can reach anywhere in Europe. Roosevelt asked his administration for more money to build up an Air Force. He's thinking if we build up our Air Force, it might send a message to potential enemies that we're capable of defending ourselves. But Congress goes, no, there's no money, we're in a depression, and we're never going to be in a war again. But then in November of 1938, the first outrage against the Jews takes place in Europe. It's a night called Kristallnacht. The Germans burn synagogues, break down stores like the German store they did to the Jewish store right here. They imprisoned hundreds of thousands of Jews in concentration camps. They killed 90 Jews. Roosevelt goes to Congress the next day and asks for 10,000 airplanes. And the public is alarmed by what's going on in Europe. So Congress debates for 7 months, and they agree to buy 5,500 airplanes over the next 5 years. The Germans now invade the lowlands. France, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg. And in 10 days, this German army defeats the combined armies of England, France, Belgium, and Holland. This is the mightiest military the world's ever seen. The blitzkrieg is now how you fight a war. Air power is now decisive. If you don't control the air over the battlefield, you cannot win a battle. Roosevelt wants to make a statement. He wants to capture the American image. So he goes on and he asks for 50,000 military airplanes a year. This is a time when the U.S. is building about 3,500 airplanes a year, many of them Piper Cubs and Aeronca Champs. When Hermann Göring heard this number, he said that's pure propaganda. No one can build 50,000 airplanes in a year. Well, 4 years later, the U.S. would produce almost 100,000 military airplanes in 1944. And he calls up his old friend Bernard Baruch. And he asks Bernard Baruch to come down to Washington to head up the mobilization. And Baruch says, I'm too old. You'll have to find somebody else. So Roosevelt asked him, who are the top 3 industrial production men in this country right now? And Baruch says, number 1 is Bill Knudsen of General Motors. Number 2 is Bill Knudsen of General Motors. You guys can all figure out who number 3 was in that conversation. The president of General Motors, Bill Knudsen, was about to be asked to come to Washington to mobilize the U.S. for World War II. This is a picture of him on May 29, 1940. He's just come down to Washington. He's just met with President Roosevelt and been given his assignment to mobilize the U.S. A remarkable man. He came to this country in 1900 with $20 in his pocket. He swept the floors and cleaned the bathrooms in his first jobs. He worked his way up through Ford Motor Company and General Motors to become president of General Motors. In 1940, he gave up a $300,000 a year income. That's a lot of money that's a lot of money today. That was really a lot of money in 1940. To work as a $1 a year man in Washington. We do not have the tools to build weapons of war. They were all destroyed after World War I. The tool and die industry is going to have to work nonstop for the next 18 months to build equipment so we can build weapons. And the 4-engine bomber production is going to fall onto the auto companies. After Roosevelt appoints Knudsen, he makes a tour of the aircraft factories, and he finds them building airplanes like prototypes because they've never had orders for more than 10 or 12 airplanes at a time. And he comes back, and he goes to the auto show in New York City, October of 1940. And they have a big dinner afterwards at Madison Square Garden. And when the dinner's over, Knudsen gets up and still speaking in his broken Danish accent, he says, we must build big bombers. We must build more bombers than we can hope to get, and we must build them sooner than we can hope to get them. I want you to meet me in Detroit in 2 weeks. Don't tell anybody what you're doing. So 2 weeks later, they come to Detroit and they go to the new center building, down by the Fisher building in the new center area. There are so many people there that they have to go next door to an abandoned butcher shop and take chairs out of a local funeral home so everybody can get in there. All the auto industry is there. The aircraft industry is there. The Army is there. And the Army is led by this guy right here, Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle was recalled to active duty in July of 1940. He was a technical expert on aviation because he was the first PhD in aeronautical engineering. And he's assigned to Detroit. Ford gives him an office in the Ford headquarters on Schaefer Road. He will play a big part in building the Willow Run bomber plant. They wanted Ford to build kits, knockdown kits, that Consolidated and Douglas will assemble into B-24s. So Ford, their head man, Charles Sorensen here, and Ethel Ford, they go out to San Diego in January of 1941, and they stayed there at the Coronado Hotel. Who's ever been to the Coronado Hotel? It's the most expensive red roof hotel in the world. And you see right here is a picture of the groundbreaking at Willow Run. There's Sorensen and Ethel Ford. And Sorensen's a production guy. He put together the Model T line at Highland Park, the Model A line at Rouge. He was a leader in the use of cast iron. He brought the V8 into the Ford Motor Company production. And he's watching Consolidated build aluminum airplanes outdoors on steel fixtures, on ground that rises and falls over time. And at the end of the day, he's taking notes, and Reuben Fleet, who's head of Consolidated, says, well, what do you think? Because he's really impressed with his production facility. And Sorensen says, this is all pretty discouraging. I don't think Ford can do anything to help you because nothing you build is identical to anything you build. And that kind of made Mr. Fleet mad. So he said to Sorensen, how would you do it? And Sorensen said, I don't know. Well, I have an answer in the morning. So Sorensen went back to the Coronado Hotel. And after dinner, he went to his room, and he started taking the flow, parts flowing into sub-assembly to final assemblies. And by 4 in the morning, he had a factory design, and he drew it on the back of hotel stationery that would build one B-24 bomber an hour. Reuben Fleet said, you're crazy. No one can do that. And Sorensen said, we'll build complete airplanes or we'll build nothing. Army was so impressed with what Ford had said he could do and how badly they needed the B-24 bomber that they awarded a $200 million contract based on pencil drawings in the back of hotel stationery and a promise to build a bomber an hour. Sorensen was facing 2 major obstacles. One, he was going to build the biggest factory in the world. He needed somebody to design and build it. So he turned to Alfred Kahn, an associate who had been building factories for Ford since 1906. And then he needed to find 3 or 4 square miles of flat, open land. And Ford has been castigated for building it out in the middle of the boondocks away from Detroit where people couldn't get to there and there was no housing. But you have to remember, by 1940, the suburbs of Garden City, Livonia, Farmington were already building houses. There was a shortage of flat open land that was not occupied. You had to go to western Wayne County to get it. So right here, on the Wayne-Washington County line, which is this road right here, Rossville Road, they elected to build the factory in Washington County and the airport in Wayne County. And here you see it. There's the factory. And here's this little creek called the Willow Run. That's how the factory got its name. There was a creek there that had the willow trees hanging by it, and it was called the Willow Run. You see a picture of the creek right there? In June of 1940, Consolidated had Hotton Associates designed this factory where the two assembly lines would deliver the airplanes out this end of the building. There would be a straight assembly line, each one of these a half-mile long, so they had a mile-long assembly line with two of them, and they'd be delivered out this end of the building. But what happened was, the Army had never participated in a mass production airplane, and they were still stuck in their practices of the 30s. And they said, well, we'll have Ford build the airplane, but they can't have any of the secret military stuff at that civilian field because it's secret, it's military. We'll have them fly it over to Romulus Airfield where we'll install the bomb sights and the turrets and paint it. And then somebody said, do you know how hard it is to paint an airplane after you've started the engines and flown it someplace? And I went, oh, maybe we should get them painted at Willow Run. And since we're going to paint them there, why don't we put all the guns and the turrets and all that stuff? We'll just have a bunch of guards running around the factory. So what happened was, they added, after they gave Ford the contract, they came back about 4 months later and said, we want you to do more. And Ford said, we can't do it in our existing factory. We don't have enough room. So they had to expand the factory. And you see right here, this is the summer of 1941. They're really building this factory rapidly. You can see the final assembly line is coming up right here. They'll deliver the airplanes out here. Here we have the manufacturing and sub-assembly areas. And you can see they're starting to lay the airfield out in the background here. And this is the blueprint of the original factory. And these were the delivery doors, and all this area down here was manufactured. Go back right here. And you see right here, this is the Wayne-Washtenaw County line, right here 6 feet outside the factory. And this is what we call Hangar 1. That's still in existence. In fact, that's where the Yankee Air Museum stores its airplanes now. They redesigned the factory, and they had to move this hangar back 320 feet because the bombers now would make a 90-degree turn and come out these south-facing doors. And you see right here, they stopped production in the original factory. They put up these plywood temporary walls. Behind these walls, they're building B-24 bombers while they finish the structure out here to make the 90-degree turn to go down to the new delivery doors. And this is the part of the factory where the airplanes will be delivered. And this is the part of the factory that the Yankee Air Museum has saved. And right here in the background, you see the first B-24 bomber coming in to land at Willow Run Airport. This is a consolidated bomber that was being flown in so Ford could look at one to determine how they should build one. And right here is Hangar 1, there's where the control tower is, they're putting the doors up. And there's the first airplane coming out of the Willow Run factory in May 15, 1942. This was a combination of Ford parts and consolidated parts. It was a prototype airplane, and it was delivered 6 months late. So by the summer of 42, Willow Run had picked up a nickname of Willow Run. But this was partly due that when Ford got the contract, they asked Consolidated for the blueprints. And Consolidated said, blueprints? We don't have blueprints. We got templates, drawings, sketches. So Ford had to send engineers to San Diego. They worked 24 hours a day, 3 8-hour shifts. They produced 5 miles of engineering drawings a day. They had to ship them back to Detroit in railroad cars. And within 3 months, 10,000 of the drawings were obsolete because Consolidated changed the airplane every time they built it. This is the plant finished in the summer of 1942. There's the roof, there's a 90-degree turn, the airplanes come out, here's Hangar 1. There's the airport laid out here. This is I-94, which will become I-94 down here, Ecorse Road, Michigan. And the first 2 triple overpasses built in the U.S. were there at the Willow Run Airport. And the significance of these is, these are going to be the first 3, or the first 2 triple overpasses to have driverless cars testing how fast they can drive on expressways. That's part of the plan for the mobility center being built on the grounds of Willow Run here, is they're going to build a high-speed curve in here that'll be close to the public, where these automated cars can go out and mix in traffic. Ford was originally supposed to build 150 knockdown kit airplanes, 75 for Consolidated in Fort Worth, 75 for Tulsa, Oklahoma City. A year later, they were to build 505, 405 flyable airplanes, and 100 knockdown kits. Well, this factory was only designed to build 150 kits a month. So they had to expand the factory. Also, working on an airplane outdoors in Michigan in the winter is difficult, if not impossible. One of the things you have to do is you have to run the engines up and check them before you fly the airplane. So in the spring of '43, they built these two temporary wooden hangars down here. They tore those down in '97. But you look at the back of these, it's all louvers. You can take a B-24 in there and run its engines up indoors to check the airplanes before you fly them. Finding employees for the factory was very, very difficult. There were no housing in the area. People would come to Willow Run, work for 4 or 5 weeks, and move. In January of '43, they hired as many people as they lost. They could not train, they couldn't get production up. So they went down to the hills of Kentucky and West Virginia, Tennessee, and they put these posters up. Ford was paying 10 times the prevailing wage that you'd find in Kentucky. If you could make $200 a year down in Kentucky, you could come up to Willow Run and make $1,500 a year. So a lot of people from the hills of Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia came up to Detroit. In fact, you probably heard the term Ypsilanti as a nickname for the city of Ypsilanti. And another thing Ford did right here, 54 hours, time and a half, over 40 hours, women paid the same as men. Ford was a leader in this industry. Your job was defined not by who you were, but by the definition of the job. Men and women made the same wages at the factory in Detroit here. This gave rise to the Rosie the River. And now you see the women here driving rivets in the center ring. And they're standing on a platform here that goes up and down to help them drive rivets. That was part of what Ford did for his automation. On the back of this is another woman holding a bucking bar to drive those rivets. A good team could do 6 rivets a minute. There are 60,000 rivets in the center wing. They had to drive 60,000 rivets an hour by hand to keep the production at a bomber an hour. I've talked to people who worked in the factory. There was no hearing protection back then. The sound was literally deafening inside that building. And this woman right here, her name is Rose Monroe. And she was one of the women who came up from Somerset, Kentucky. And when I was writing this book, I interviewed her daughter and got some insight on her mother when she worked at the factory. And she was working at an assembly line, and a Hollywood actor named Walter Pitcher was coming through the factory just talking to people. And he saw what she was doing, and he says, "Hi, what's your name?" She says, I'm Rose Monroe. And he said, "I'm honest to God, Rosie the River." And she became the Rosie the River, and they made a Rosie the River movie out there at Willow Run, and she was the star. There's Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford. Henry Ford took his only flight in his entire life with Charles Lindbergh in 1937. They went up in the Spirit of St. Louis and flew around Dearborn. Ford and Lindbergh became great friends. And Lindbergh would visit Henry Ford many times at his Fairlane complex. And when World War II came, because Lindbergh had openly opposed Roosevelt, resigned his Air Force commission, he was blackballed by Roosevelt. He could not be in the military. He could not work in the aircraft industry. So he asked the Army if he'd go to work for Henry Ford. And the airman said, yeah, you can do that, because that's an auto company. So he came out to Willow Run, and he was a Ford test pilot for 2 years. He wrote a book called The Wartime Dribbles of Charles Lindbergh, and he's got probably 150 pages in there about his experiences at Willow Run as a test pilot for Ford Motor Company. This is a picture of Jimmy Doolittle. This is a month after his famous Tokyo raid. He has not been assigned to Europe yet to take over the 12th Air Force, and he came back to Willow Run to see how Willow was going, because it was his idea to get Ford to build these B-24 parts. He was involved in that right up to the time that he went on the Tokyo raid. And here you see him with Henry Ford, Edsel Ford, Charles Sorensen, Benson Ford, and Charles Lindbergh. So you've got a lot of famous people in that picture, and that's the first Ford-built B-24 behind them. This is chapter 10 of my book, and you'll see inside here, I've got circles that relate to each photo. So when you go through the book and you read a photo, you can go back to this diagram and get an idea of where it was taken in the factory and what was going on at that time. Down at this end was the tooling room. This was a manufacturing area, the press department, center wing, front and rear fuselage, and then the 2 final assembly lines that came out the paint was down here. There were 950 parts that Ford stamped out in hard steel die presses. And the aircraft industry had never done this, and they chided Ford for doing this, but Ford said, I can knock out pieces with 2 10,000th-inch tolerance, which means there's no custom fitting, the parts snapping the jigs, and anybody can put them together. But they had a problem. They only had 75 presses. So they had to schedule that this press is going to run 450 Station 2 wing gussets today. Then we're going to put them in baskets someplace, because tomorrow it's going to run Station 4, 450. So they had to keep the presses going, not on a daily basis, but the presses worked 4 to 6 weeks in advance to ensure that they got the proper thing. And you'll notice right here that there's women operating this press, something that had never been done in industry before. But what happened when the women came into the factory, at first they were given women-only jobs. Sewing fabric on the controls, putting wiring bundles together. But pretty soon, as they ran out of men, they started putting women into the jobs, and they found there was no such thing as a man-only job. The women could do everything in the factory the men could. So they let them do it. And right here, this is the heart and soul of Ford manufacturing. All of the prefabricated parts that go in the winger station here, they're on these racks, and there are 43 of these 27-ton stations where the wing pieces snap in there, and then they're assembled, and they can pull the wing out of the top without taking the jig apart. Right here, you see the women building the cockpit. Now, this is kind of unusual for Ford. This station was a constantly moving station, like a merry-go-round. And the women would ride the merry-go-round, and at each station they would add parts to come up with a complete cockpit floor. Underneath here, there's somebody working in the bottom. They had to connect all of these cables that would snap out to the areas of the wings so you could operate the airplane. This is Eddie Greenbacker, World War I ace, and he's greeting what Henry Ford called the little people, the midgets. Ford hired 8 midgets, 4 per shift. Ford ran 2 9-hour shifts 6 days a week. And the midgets loved their jobs at Willow Run. For the first time in their life, they were paid the same wage as anybody else, and they were being paid for something they could do as opposed to being stared at as some freak in a sideshow. They really, the memoirs of these guys are very, very highly praised of Henry Ford. Because when you see what they did, they're putting the outer wing to the center wing, and right in there you see one of the little people. He's going to hold the backing plates to attach the bolts that hold the outer wing up. And right here, you see the airplanes coming down to their 90-degree turntable right here. And then they're going to make the turn to the south to go towards the delivery doors. And this picture right here, you've got two parallel assembly lines. There's 90 B-24s under production at any one time. This airplane right here will probably fly later today. That's how close the production was. Now you see this, the airplanes coming out the south doors of the building. These have already been fueled. There's a fuel station right here where they put the fuel in them. They'll test run the engines, do some cycles on them, and then they'll go on a 2.5 hour acceptance flight before being delivered to the Army. After the Battle of the Bulge, the war in Europe was going badly. It looked like maybe Germany might survive much, much longer than anyone thought. And they came up with a new B-24 bomber. This is the B-24M. It has a single tail and a different type of nose turret that took that tail turret they used to have out there. Ford got a contract to build 2,200 of the B-24Ms in January of 1945. They started tooling up for it, and then in the end of March, Germany was already collapsing. They canceled the contract. Ford built 7 of these single-tail B-24s. The pilots who flew this said it was a dream to fly compared to the twin-tail B-24. It was a real pilot's airplane flying. On the ramp right here, you see all these airplanes on the ground. The war in Europe is over, and they've flown the B-24s back to Willow Run, and they're going to be reconditioned and reserviced for war in the Pacific. But by the time they get them ready to go, it's the middle of August and the war in the Pacific is over. And you can see right here, this is June of 45, the parking lots are just about empty. There's not much going on at Willow Run at this time. And there we are, the last airplane being delivered, and I thank you for your kind attention. Any questions, any comments? Yes?
How long did it take from, say, the first station to the aircraft going out the...
When they put the wing on the final assembly line, that wing was 5 days from being delivered. It was 7 days from flying to 5 days from being delivered. The average time from the time a part was stamped out to a flying airplane was 25 days. And this had over 1.3 million parts. So there was a lot of parts to coordinate coming together for that schedule. Yes?
I was a 10-year-old at the time, 1945. And we kids were involved in gathering any aluminum to for the scrap drive.
Yes.
I mean, and my parents would not allow us to take money for any worthwhile job like that. And it was interesting to hear that. I remember I was coming home from school when I heard the war was over. I had 2 brothers, one in the Pacific and one in Europe with packing. And I couldn't, the war is over. I, as a kid, all I was taught was go to school, get good marks, and besides that, look for any scrap metal. Okay, okay. We were a working family, and everybody worked.
Now, where did you live?
Sir?
Where did you live?
In Detroit,
Okay.
on Farnsworth and Du Bois.
Okay.
Okay, and Dad worked in for bone aluminum and brass, and he had a gasoline sticker on, the same as a doctor. Okay, because he worked on repairing the fire in those furnaces. Okay, and when, again, something weird in my lifetime is to hear the phone ring, and it's always for Dad. Okay, they've got some problem, what over there, Dad's gone, okay? And we were a mile and a half from the factory. But he was like a doctor in the fact that it wasn't the case of, I don't feel good, I don't feel like doing this. He went because he had 2 sons over there. And so the interesting part was we all had jobs that we worked. My sisters, there was of a family of 7, 5 boys and 2 girls. And we all worked, Daddy and Mom included. Mom worked at Federal's. It was a department store. Dad worked for Mobilize Grass, and that's the only job he had because he was needed at all times of the day and night. When something went wrong, he had to be there to either to advise or to actually do the work. Anyway, it was an interesting childhood.
Now, did you ever visit Willow Run during that time?
Sir?
Did you ever see Willow Run during that time?
No, heard about it,
Okay.
knew people who worked there, okay, because we were near Detroit Transmission, okay, a block and a half away from Detroit Transmission. And I don't know all the different parts they made there, but a lot of people in our neighborhood worked there and didn't talk about the job. If you were asking questions about the job, you had to be a spy. Okay. It's things like that.
Little bit over here.
How many employees did we have working?
Peak employee was 43,000 in the spring of 1943. The trouble was they could never get enough employees and retain enough employees. So Meat Bricker was given, one of the things that Truman found, the Truman Committee came in to investigate Willow Run. And his committee was looking for fraud. Well, they came in to look at Willow Run, and they basically said nobody could run Willow Run because there's too many people who think they run it. Ford thinks they run it, the Army thinks they run it, Consolidated thinks they run it, and you can never get anything done. You need a plant dictator. So they appointed Meat Bricker as the plant dictator. Nobody could run Willow Run except him. The Army had to call him, and he could say, hell no, I'm not going to do it, hang the phone up. And what he did was, he farmed out the manufacturing to where the people were. He sent the nacelle build-up, one of the most complicated products there, to the Lincoln factory at Livernois and Warren. He sent the outer wings to Highland Park. He sent the stabilizers to the Rouge plant. He sent the flaps to the Gibson Refrigerator Company. He farmed out as much as he could, and at peak production, Willow Run was building a bomber an hour with 19,000 employees. They worked 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week for peak production. Yes.
You keep referring to the fact that the Army is building these planes,
Yes.
which I find rather surprising because I thought it was the Air Force that would be building these planes.
Well, there was no Air Force until 1947.
Although it's not.
There was the Army Air Force, but all the contracts ran through the Army. It's kind of like the Marine Corps is part of the Navy. The Marine Corps does not have a supply system. They have a Navy supply system, and the Navy is the entity that issues contracts for all Marine Corps equipment. So in those days, the Army issued all the contracts for the Army Air Corps, Army Air Force. It became the Air Force in 1941.